Last week we covered what is a relationship. Today we're going to look at the responsibilities in a relationship. Can you give us some insight as to what are the responsibilities of a relationship?
Last week we said a relationship is a connection, and a connection that is formed after the consideration of conditions. Right?
Okay.
We spoke about that in the legal and business context.
Yes.
We said that the Western, in the Western cultural perspective, what the business and legal will refer to as conditions we call expectations. Right now, these conditions, these expectations, are also called promises. Right?
Okay.
So once you agree to these conditions, you have technically made a promise. Promises have been made on both sides of the coin, on both from both parties. Right now, we actually see this in Scripture, because the Old Covenant, for example, which is the old relationship agreement, as we said, was pretty much a proposal presented to Israel that they had to agree to. So that covenant had actually expectations for Israel, as well as expectations for God.
All right.
So when Moses presented this covenant to Israel, and they agreed to the 613 expectations, and that is actually what they call commandments. The expectations on God's side is actually what we call promises. And the thing is, the word that is, even though on Israel's side it's actually, these expectations are called commandments, and on God's side it's actually called promises. It's the same Hebrew word that is translated in using those two different words. So we can also say that Israel's side are their promises.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why in Exodus it's actually referred to as Israel's words. That's Israel's promises. And on God's side is actually called God's promises or God's words. All right. Just as in the Old Covenant, if we use the Bible as the reference point for what agreements would be, we are pretty much looking at responsibilities being keeping your promises. If you agree to the expectations, keep your promises.
All right. Awesome. So keeping your promises, is that equivalent to loving, showing some sort of love or regard for the relationship?
Oh yes. If we actually look at the God, our Father, as the reference point here again, when this agreement was made between God and Israel, it is clearly stated in the scriptures, if you love me, keep my commandments. Right? In other words, if you love me, keep your promises.
So then if we're looking at love as keeping your promises, then the opposite of love is hate, if you don't keep your promises.
Yes, it is, and that's also seen in the book of Exodus with regards to the relationship between God and Israel. He clearly said that actually not keeping the commandments, not keeping their promises, is hating him. He even went on to say that is also considered hostility against him.
Okay. So another question that brings me to, how do you build trustworthiness in a relationship?
It's the same context actually. All right. When we make agreements and we agree to the expressed expectations, trustworthiness is simply keeping your promises. Exactly what you say that you whatever you have agreed to,
Mm-hmm.
you actually obey it. I hate to use the word obey because we're not in relationships in our society. Our relationships are pretty much influenced by culture, and so there's no legalities involved until you get married. And even marriage is an agreement, even though in the world today it is not looked at or viewed at from the perspective of the actual definition of the word relationship. So to build trustworthiness is to simply keep your promises.
But taking that into consideration now, it brings or it highlights that God built his trustworthiness by responding to Israel's untrustworthiness.
As a matter of fact, God speaks about his trustworthiness in scriptures as if it is a badge to wear on his chest, as if he is a trophy. Because with Israel, with his agreement between himself and Israel, the agreement was that once Israel kept the 613 promises, that he would respond by keeping his promises. And even if they did not, having been initiated into the agreement, even if they choose to be indifferent concerning their promises, the agreement was structured in a way where he had another list that he was obligated to fulfill. Right? That list, those lists would be referred to as the blessings and the curses. So he speaks about his trustworthiness so much because he has never once been found to not keep his promise once the other party keep their promise.
Wow. So what we have interpreted as God being harsh or stern towards the Israelites was actually God keeping himself or proving his faithfulness to the covenant.
Yes, actually. It's actually God showing his trustworthiness. It's actually that's a really good question, because it's commonly taught within the popular church doctrines that God is a wrathful God.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, anybody who reads the scriptures without trying to find the context of the entire Old Testament would actually come to that assumption because of the judgments that Israel faced. But all of that was actually rooted in the agreement that Israel voluntarily made with God. Now, if you actually look at the book of Exodus, it says that after God presented the agreement, Israel had 613 conditions or expectations that they had to agree to. And he had a list of expectations on his side that was based on their fulfillment of their expectations.
Awesome.
Right? So, but that agreement had two faces, like two sides of the coin.
Right.
After having been initiated into the agreement, once they were faithful to their promises or their commandments,
Right.
God would then be technically, legally obligated by the agreement. And I say legally obligated because there are many times that there are many times in scriptures, and with the prophet Micah, with the prophet Hosea, God said through them that when Israel went contrary, they showed indifference to their promises. They broke the commandments, indifference to their promises and breaking the commandments. He said that I have a legal case against you.
Yes.
Right? So when that agreement was made, it was stated that once they fulfill the expectations or their promises, the expectations that they agreed to, he is now legally obligated by that covenant to fulfill a list of promises. That is what everyone in the church arenas call the blessings.
Yes.
But having been initiated into the covenant, ratified and then initiated by physical circumcision, if you showed indifference to the expectations that you agreed to fulfill your promises, he had another list that he was legally obligated to fulfill.
Yes.
It is what we call the list of curses.
Okay.
Right? Now, when Israel, a lot of people don't know this. So when they see the wrath, they say, "But God is a wrathful God." It was not a loving God. Yes, it was a loving God, and the love is actually demonstrated in the simple fact that every single time Israel showed indifference, he did not immediately grab the opportunity to start the list of curses. He sent prophets, begging with them, pleading with them, reminding them of the agreement that they made and asking them to please come back to the agreement. And after lengths of time of doing that, then he had to fall back on being trustworthy, meaning that once he said what he said that he will do, if they showed indifference, after all the begging and pleading and the reminders, they pretty much forced him to get back to the covenant and to fulfill the list of curses. So in that context, what you're looking at there is a very loving God and a very untrustworthy Israel.
Right.
An Israel that showed him great hostility.
Wow, this really puts a new face to God.
Yeah.
We've commonly been taught that, he is very wrathful, and so it's a bit frightful, to say the least, when you look at the treatment that Israel received. But based on what you explain, it breaks it down, makes it a lot more clear as to why God did what he did with them. Now, coming to general relationships now, would you say, seeing that you stated hostility is breaking promises and love or trustworthiness is actually keeping it, would you say that with general relationships we should take an approach to communicate our expectations, even with friends and family and so on?
Clearly, most definitely, because even though it's not legal agreements, it's still relationships, it's connections that are formed with the expectation of reciprocation of something.
Right.
And if both parties are not familiar with what the other party is expecting and or hoping to be reciprocated,
yes,
then you started a relationship doomed for destruction.
Wow, this is really helpful.
And as a matter of fact, I'll add this, that just as in the old covenant, both covenants in scripture, whether it be the old relationship agreement or the new relationship agreement, and applying the concept of relationship to the Western world, to our Western culture. If you understand that, you should understand the difference between faith and hope. See, in our Western culture, we say we hope that she does this, or we hope that he does this.
Right.
That's simply because you hope that he is faithful. You hope that she is faithful. That's simply because the absence of expressed expectations leaves nothing to hold the party responsible to.
Oh boy, yes.
So you're actually in hope.
That's so true.
With the presence of expressed expectations, you have faith in the integrity of the party, or the party that you're dealing with, your spouse, your friend, whoever you're dealing with. You have faith that they will actually show integrity and keep their promises. And this, by the way, is what is different between hope and faith, even in scripture. So that if you understand that, because of your relationship agreement with God, you can have faith that He will demonstrate His integrity by keeping His promises once you keep your side of the agreement, as the agreement clearly expresses. But I'll be bold to say this, that most of the Christian body who are not familiar with this, they don't really have faith in God. What they have is hope, because they are not familiar with what their side of the agreement is, and but they're very familiar with what God's side of His promises are, without being familiar with what is responsible for them. And because they don't know what is responsible for them, what they are responsible for, they are in hope that God moves.
Yes.
And deep down inside, each saint knows that there is something that they need to do to please God. That's because it is their nature. It is the nature of their spirit to be in an agreement. And because nobody's explaining this, Christians run from church to church, listening to sermons and doctrines that twist their mindsets as to what the responsibilities are. But it's clearly stated in scripture. So once they are familiar with what they are responsible for, and they keep that strict and steady, then they can have faith in God fulfilling His promises.
We have the Old Testament as proof that God was very faithful, and He still is today.
We also have the New Testament as proof, because all of the apostles understood their agreement, and from that agreement, the power flowed.
This is so good.
Yes, it is.
guys, that brings us to the end of our second blog in Spiritual Relational Intelligence. Today we covered what are the responsibilities of the relationship. We also looked at the relationship that God had with Israel, and well, the covenant he had with Israel, the responsibilities that he had, that they had. We call blessings and curses. We look at his faithfulness and his trustworthiness. Please put into the comments how this has helped you, how this has helped your understanding, what stood out the most to you from this blog. Don't forget to like and subscribe on our YouTube channel. Also Zane and Keturah Authors and Coaches, our Facebook page. Like and hit the share button. We also have WordPress, zanepair.wordpress.com.
Yes, we do.
And don't forget to like this video also, and keep it going, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in today, and y'all do have an awesome week. Stay tuned for more.
Boom.
And photo.